Okay, well, I think we can go ahead and get started now. I see that we're online. Give folks who are joining us online just a few minutes to, just a minute to join in. Welcome to those who are already here to our webinar today on, it's called the Emergency Survival Guide for Leaders, Faith that Leads the Way and Calms the Storms. This is a CCIH webinar. Thank you to CCIH for hosting this and bringing this together. This is one of a series of webinars that will guide us to a deeper insight and more clarity about how Christian professionals can better carry out the work that really God gives us to do. I'll be your guide today. I'll say a few more things about that. My name is Doug Fountain, and I will say a few more things about that. But first off, a few details for those of you who are joining online. To pose a question, please use Google Chrome as your browser and sign in with your Google account if you want to pose a question in the comment box. That's important because we're using Google Hangouts and Google Chrome like to talk to each other. If you're not using Chrome, we suggest you switch. It's more certain to work that way. However, if you are joining through another means, if you prefer, you may also email questions to us at the following email address is Mona Borme, M-O-N-A, period, B-O-R-M for Mary, E-T, at ccih.org. You can see that on the screen there. So please go ahead and do that if you are not joining through Chrome. So once again, thank you for joining us with this webinar on Emergency Survival Guide for Leaders, Faith that Leads the Way and Calms the Storms. Again, I'm Doug Fountain. And by way of background, just on myself, I am there's my bio. I serve right now as the Interim Executive Director at CCIH. I'm also a consultant in global health and higher education. And it's my privilege really to work with today with two exceptional leaders who are going to take us through these topics. So Dr. Jonathan Quick, he is a family physician, international public health expert, author, and speaker on a mission to protect humanity from deadly infectious disease epidemics. He's the author of The End of Epidemics, The Looming Threat to Humanity and How to Stop It, which was published earlier this year. He's also Senior Fellow Emeritus and former President and CEO at the global health nonprofit Management Sciences for Health. He sits on the faculty of Harvard Medical School and serves as the chair of the Global Health Council. He was previously the director of essential medicines at the World Health Organization. His writings have appeared in numerous publications, including Time, Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, Forbes, and many others. So we're grateful to have Jono with us today. Also today we have Carrie Hessler-Radelet. She's the president and CEO of Project Concern International, which is a global development organization working with families and communities to enhance health and hunger and overcome hardship in 18 countries. Hessler-Radelet, Carrie, served as director of the Peace Corps from 2012 through 2017. Actually, she started as a deputy director beginning in 2010, so quite a run with the Peace Corps. She spent decades leading global health efforts with John Snow Incorporated, consulting on programs for USAID and the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR. She also founded the Special Olympics in the Gambia and served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Western Samoa. She is trained with a master's in science in health policy and management from Harvard. So again, we're grateful and very pleased to have Carrie with us today. So thank you all, and I hope by now everybody who's joining us online has had a chance to plug in and get connected. So we'll go ahead and jump in. The way that this is going to work today is we'll set up a series of discussion questions for each of our presenters. They'll have a chance to go through and talk with each other. We'll handle it a little bit informally as a discussion, and I'll help guide through that, and I'll be monitoring for questions that come in. If they're appropriate for where we are in the discussion, then I'll introduce the question that comes from the audience. Otherwise, we'll have time towards the end of our hour to gather 4 questions that come. So I'll help monitor and manage for that. But first off, to get us started, Jono and Carrie, could you take a few minutes to help us know you and your own faith journeys, particularly as they relate to leadership? I'll go ahead and give Jono a chance to start off with that.
Thanks very much, Doug. Thank you to everyone for joining this morning. And thank you to Carrie for being part of this and CCIH for organizing it. My journey to genuine faith actually began in my late 40s. We just moved to Geneva to join the World Health Organization after living in Pakistan and Kenya. Had 3 young daughters at the time, and quickly found myself with 2 jobs and 2 offices at the World Health Organization, one of which involved regular confrontations with a $300 billion a year pharmaceutical industry. And the other involved regular confrontations with the Staff Association, because it was a working group on trying to reform the human resources approach at the World Health Organization. I basically went into a workaholic, not alcoholic, workaholic downward spiral. I lost touch with the family, and was continually breaking promises with my daughters to see them in sports, and basically they asked me to leave. I didn't, and my wife, whose depth of faith I'd not fully appreciated, said to me, "You've got to talk to the pastor. You got to get yourself fixed. You have to learn how to give it up to God." And I had been raised in a Presbyterian church and led the communicants class and did things, was regularly going to church. But in this depth, this kind of workaholic spiral, I realized that actually I didn't know how to read the Bible. I didn't know how to pray, and I wasn't convinced. And that really started a 3-year journey of reading and conversation that really brought me to be 100% convinced that God was real, that Jesus lived, and that he was our Savior. And one of my favorite verses for that time is from Romans 4. "Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything through prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds." And I think that promise of joy and releasing anxieties and the peace of Christ really helped me get through. I rebuilt my relations with the family. We're now really close and have a weekly 4-state calls that always end with a prayer. And I've soon found that starting the day with prayer and engagement in God helped me keep on track with what we needed to do in the office and the work we were trying to achieve, but also that when I tried to do it on my own, it didn't work. Far from perfect, and still don't exemplify all the fruits of the Spirit. But I know that I'm not alone, and that I couldn't be doing what I've done over the last several decades without God above and a genuine faith that He's real and there is joy and peace in our God.
Thanks for that, John. Let's hear from Carrie for a minute on her own journey, and then I'll come back to you with a follow-up question about this. Carrie?
Thank you so much, Doug. And John, thank you for that beautiful story. I mean, that was incredible and so heartfelt. You know, my story is much less dramatic in some ways. I was raised in a Christian family. I developed a relationship with Jesus while I was in college. I was a member of FCA, Fellowship of Christian Athletes. But I received a great deal of support from my family around my faith commitment. One thing that is important, and maybe to distinguish my family from others at the time, I grew up in Appleton, Wisconsin, a very, very much a middle America kind of place where everyone went to church, basically. That was my culture. But my family was very committed to civil rights, both my parents, but also my grandparents. And so we traveled frequently to Milwaukee and to Chicago to participate in rallies. My parents were very actively engaged with the Ecumenical Institute, and we became involved in a program to bring kids from inner cities up to Appleton, Wisconsin. So starting when I was 7 years old, we had young people starting. I mean, like the first one to come to our house was Doria Lynn, and she was 7, just like I was. And she came to live with us for 2 weeks. And then I went at age 7 back to live with her in her apartment in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which was in a project. And we continued that relationship of exchange with that family for many years. It was also my first encounter with racism in my own hometown, because my neighbors were distraught with the fact that we had a young child of color, a beautiful young girl living there. And in fact, our neighbor put up a giant no trespassing sign, whereas before they had been just wonderful neighbors. So it was really a very stark introduction to racism. I also want to say that when I was living with Doria Lynn and her family in Milwaukee, we received nothing but love and support and kindness. So it really hit home to me. My family is also a Peace Corps family. My family is the only 4-generation Peace Corps family. My aunt was a Peace Corps volunteer in Turkey in the 60s. My grandparents, both of them, joined Peace Corps after they retired in the early 70s when they were 68 years old and served in Malaysia. My husband, Steve, and I served in Western Samoa in the Pacific. And then the last generation is my nephew, who served in Mozambique. My faith was very much at the heart of my decision to serve in Peace Corps, because my faith as taught and lived by my family was very much tied up with the fact that service to humanity, and including, and especially I would say, service to the poor is at the heart of our faith initiative and faith relationship with God. I would say that I have a very simple faith. It is not sophisticated at all. I really believe that loving God and loving others is the core of all faith, and I begin every single day for praying that I would be a channel for God's love, that my words would demonstrate God's love. I am far from perfect in that, and I have to catch myself every single day. I also think a lot about fear. I started thinking about fear when I was at Peace Corps, because there was a lot happening when I was the director of the Peace Corps. Always there were 10,000 lives every single day that I felt responsible for. And I really had to let that go to God. And I pray every single day that I won't let fear cloud my own judgment, my own decision making. And I believe that God's perfect love drives out fear. Often when I analyze my own negative feelings, whatever they are, I often find that fear is at the very root of that. And so I usually just really pray a lot about not letting fear drive my decision making or my actions. The subject of this webinar is really about faith that leads the way and calms the storm. And I have to say that the most difficult thing I've ever had to do was when I was Peace Corps director and having to call the families of volunteers who have been killed in service. And I had to do that 16 times. Oh. And that was so hard. And I could never have done that without prayer first, extensive prayer, and prayer with other senior leaders that I happily had with me at Peace Corps. We prayed before we made that call. We knew that those words would shatter that family's lives forever. And so I really relied so heavily on prayer and on God's love and wisdom to guide my words during that incredibly difficult time. There are no words for times like that. And I just want to say that through that process, over a number of different times, I mean, it seems like a lot of lives, but if you consider that when I was at Peace Corps, 40,000 volunteers went through during that same time. 16 is a huge number, and it's 16 too many. But every single time it was incredibly painful, but the grace and the love that I experienced from those families was extraordinary. And I was so inspired by the families themselves, especially families that had a strong faith to guide them. And there's one family in particular, Susan and Stephen Balog, whose daughter Emily was killed in a car accident in Paraguay. Their faith, they were one of the first people I ever had to call, and their faith ministered to me and to all who knew them and allowed me to be able to do my job. So I am constantly inspired by the people around me. Mm-hmm. And that goes now for my organization, PCI. I'm so lucky and fortunate, really. It's not luck, it's really God's grace that I'm surrounded by wonderful people who really demonstrate God's love to me on a daily basis. For that, I'm so grateful.
I take so much. Sorry, I'm getting a little. I get so much encouragement from hearing leaders like you talk. I see what you've done, and I know that you in turn have also seen other leaders. We're going to talk about other leaders in a moment. But as you weather storms, as you have gone through some of the difficult times in your own leadership experiences, how has faith helped you? I'm curious, maybe Jono and Carrie have both given a little bit of insights about tough areas that they've worked in, but maybe go a little bit deeper on that. Jono, can you give us a little bit more insight about what it took for you to succeed in weathering the storms at the WHO?
Well, yes, Doug. So one of the times that was one of the most difficult times was when a new director general was just coming in. This was 1998, and said to all of the directors, think about doing something else. I wasn't sure if I'd have a job. And it was the fourth continent for our family. So there was a concern there. But more than that, the issues that we were handling in 1998, AIDS had basically become a chronic disease in the north, rapidly emptying hospitals with the highly active antiretroviral therapy being proven. And people on treatment were living almost as long on treatment with AIDS as they would have without AIDS. It was amazing. But for most of the world's population, all but 1% in Africa, AIDS was still a death sentence. So there was a major movement starting to make AIDS drugs available. But this was just when the international patent laws were coming into place, and the pharmaceutical industry was fighting over against making these drugs available. So there was a resolution that was introduced at the World Health Assembly that basically had the North and the South against each other, debating an entire week about a resolution that would have made medicines much more available. And Friday afternoon, with probably 500 people in the room at the World Health Assembly, the resolution is bounced off by a sort of a set piece of northern governments, which had worked out a way of just deferring the resolution. The South was absolutely furious, and it ended Friday afternoon with 500 people there. Ended with a 20-minute shouting match between the U.S. ambassador and the U.S. political attaché and the South African ambassador, and the meeting just ended in chaos. And I walked out that day at 5 o'clock, basically feeling like all of the efforts were lost, that we let down the countries of the South. I walked out with a woman from South Africa who led the negotiation, and we felt incredibly defeated. And I felt like that was it. I walked in, and my wife said, "Have you prayed about it?" And I hadn't. So I sat down, and I just couldn't see any way out of this total gridlock. Spent the next half hour in prayer, and it just unrolled the way of bringing together different parties potentially. So I got on the phone Friday night with the Norwegians and the Swazis and others, and got up early and met with folks. And then 9 o'clock Saturday morning, it all came together. I really didn't know. 12 hours before, I couldn't have imagined. And that was one of several times when answered prayer really, I found did something powerful in the world through the work that we were doing, but in a way that it really felt like a God thing, God's hand in the life of the work that we were trying to do to provide treatment. And I just there was no question in my mind at all that it could have been done without that divine inspiration and guidance. Today we've got 17 million on treatment.
You said something about the prayer to get you out of the gridlock. Did it change you in ways as well as change the circumstance?
Oh yeah, I mean, I was in a talk about fear. Carrie talked about fear, and that is an incredibly powerful and very destructive force. Often, I was gridlocked in fear when I walked home. Fear, embarrassment, loss of job, fear of letting people down, the people we were trying to treat. And not only did that 30-minute prayer give me a solution, but it gave me an incredible sense of peace and confidence moving ahead, knowing that I was not alone. It was not, and it wasn't me. It was me working on behalf of our God.
Wow, wonderful. Thank you for that. And Carrie, let's come back to you with the same kind of question. Thank you so much for what you shared about your own experience, and I just want to start with the fact 4 generations in the Peace Corps, and that's a family legacy, but you rose to the top, and you had the tough jobs. Calling the families sounds gut-wrenching to me. But I love what you said about fear, and Jono just picked right up on that about prayer to get you through the gridlock of fear as well. I love that. But tell us a little bit about maybe a storm that you've experienced, perhaps in that role, something that you perhaps didn't anticipate, when you took in the role, or maybe you did anticipate it. I don't know. Tell us about a storm that you went through.
Yeah, I mean, when I think back in my life, probably the biggest storm I ever faced was about 2 weeks after I was sworn in as Deputy Director of the Peace Corps, so brand new, didn't know anything. We got a call from Brian Ross at 2020, the ABC program 2020, which you may know is a program that is an expose program. So when you get a call from Brian Ross, you know you're in trouble. And basically, he was exploring the murder of a Peace Corps volunteer, Kate Pusey, that had taken place a year before in Benin, which was horrific. And the family had not received the kind of care and support that they needed and deserved from Peace Corps. So that was why they were calling. And at first, our agency was gripped by fear. Now, I was the Deputy Director, I wasn't the Director. But the decision was made to not go on the program and to more or less just send a statement. And I like I said, I was brand new, and I just, like when I prayed about it that night, I just knew God was telling me that is not the right decision, because they were what they were saying is that Peace Corps was not responsive, that they were not caring about the family, that we weren't doing everything we possibly could to support them. And it felt to me that a non-response or a statement that would be read on the air would just reinforce the message that we didn't care. Mm. And so, I determined through prayer that I had to go on that program. I had to be the one to be on that program. And so I said, look, I feel strongly that we should not put a big fat no comment, that we really need to say something. We need to participate in that program. And so I went on the program, and it was a very painful experience. I had no media training. As part of that, I did go down and meet Lois and Harry Pusey, who have turned out to be lifelong friends and such a blessing in my life. And I have learned so much, again, from Lois and from Harry before he passed away, about grace and about love. But anyway, while I was on the air with 2020, all of a sudden there was a cut to a segment where they brought up 6 Peace Corps volunteers who had been sexually assaulted during the Peace Corps. And again, they had not received good support. They had not been treated humanely. They had not gotten the care that they needed. We're not on this part of the program, and it was very difficult to deal with at the time on air. But what they had to say, their painful and brave stories, touched such a chord in my heart, because although I have many times talked about the fact that I started my career in development as a Peace Corps volunteer, I had remained silent for more than 30 years about the fact that I had been sexually assaulted as a Peace Corps volunteer. Not only had I been sexually assaulted, but I had been sexually assaulted 3 times by my associate Peace Corps director, and all the attacks took place in the Peace Corps office.
Oh my.
So it was a grim situation for me as a volunteer, and I had never reported because there wasn't a safe environment for me to report. And so I understood very well on a very painful level what those volunteers were saying on air. You know, and so that really was a huge jolt. And I had to go back and process my own feelings as a Peace Corps volunteer when I had been assaulted. And basically, I had never reported because I was scared. I was embarrassed. I feared that they may make me leave, that I'd be forced to leave my community and the work that I loved. I really felt also, I would say, some extra pressure given the fact that I was the 3rd generation. And when I went into Peace Corps, they had written a story about the fact that the first 3rd generation family was being, placed. And I wanted to be a good Peace Corps volunteer, and that did not include being a victim of sexual assault. And I did not want my assailant to steal my Peace Corps experience, so I buried the incident deep inside my heart. And it wasn't until I was on that program that I had to finally come to terms with that violation.
Wow.
And I want to say that my experience is not so different from other people. I mean, I understand why people don't report, because in many places there's no safety to be able to report. And I did not speak about it on the program because that was, without question, not a safe place. But after that, I had to really pray about what are the next steps. And I knew that if I were going to be an authentic leader of change within Peace Corps, I was going to have to confront my own painful sexual assault, and I needed to go public with it. I had to be honest about it, which means, now I had told my husband about it, but I had never told my children. I had never told my family, my brothers and sisters. I never told any of my fellow Peace Corps volunteers. I had never told any of the Peace Corps staff people with whom I worked. And I had to tell the Peace Corps community because it had to be made real in the same way that now you're seeing the hashtag #MeToo movement. It's so important for people to be able to tell their story, and because the truth telling is healing in and of itself. So that was the beginning of an incredibly long journey to create Peace Corps' Sexual Assault Risk Reduction and Response Program, it really became the centerpiece of my work at the Peace Corps. It was formally launched in 2013. The program consists of more than 30 different policy changes, training for every single volunteer and staff person, the creation of an Office of Victim Advocacy, specialized training in trauma-informed care by first responders, development of an anonymous hotline for volunteers that's managed by an independent organization. And then we created a sexual assault advisory council that was comprised of our nation's leading experts that would really guide our agency in our quest to continue its support to volunteers. So that was the hardest thing I had to really confront, and I had to confront it in public many times. But so now in preparing for this conversation, I knew I was going to talk about this, and so I started praying about, well, what am I going to say about that? And in doing so, I recognized, and it really hit me upside the head, that I had never, ever forgiven my assailant. I had buried it so deeply within myself that I had ceased to think about it, which meant that I had never forgiven him. And that, as we know, is so critical to healing and also just to repair the relationship I had with him. Now, he passed away 10 years ago, so I was never able to confront my attacker. But I am working towards forgiveness now. I think it's profoundly important. And I also have come to the realization that I don't know his history. You know, oftentimes people who bully or attack or abuse were themselves abused as a child. So I don't know what his reality is, but I am really trying hard to forgive him. And I am grateful to CCIH because it's quite possible that I would have gone to my grave without actually examining that if it weren't for this conversation. So thank you so much.
Wow. Wow. I'm speechless at that, Carrie, and what an amazing testimony that is. I can't imagine the sense of being on a program and having to confront the most deeply personal and difficult things imaginable live, you know, as it were, like that, and having to adjust in real time. Something that you said about authentic leaders, you know, you said something about authentic leaders, and I wrote a little note to myself: authentic leaders confront the hard stuff, and it's you know, that's almost a trivial point given what you've shared, but the point is that whatever it is, you have to confront it. And sometimes when leaders share deeply about their own you know, from your own experience, it just seems like sharing deeply is a healing thing just in and of itself. There will be many people that will be tracking this webinar who will draw courage or draw encouragement, or also think about the fact that forgiveness is important. So thank you for that.
Carrie, let me ask, how would Peace Corps be now if you hadn't had your faith in the role that you played?
You know, that's a very good question that I have honestly actually never reflected on. I mean, my faith is so tied up with who I am that, you know, it's hard for me to answer because virtually everything I do is informed by prayer. At least I try, and I shouldn't say that because often I make decisions in the heat of the moment, and often I make mistakes. But the big issues I prayed about a lot, and I had other people with whom I could pray at Peace Corps that were really helpful to me in that. During the time that I was at Peace Corps, we went through extreme reform. Virtually every aspect of our work was reformed. And it began with our taking on the issue of sexual assault head on, because it forced us to recognize that over the years, Peace Corps is full of wonderful and kind people who are incredibly dedicated to our mission and to our volunteers. But like most bureaucracies, over time, they can become pretty intense, entrenched, and start serving themselves. I mean, it's just naturally happens with any organization. And so we through this process of confronting the issue of sexual assault, which was actually very painful because a lot of the people who were providing first response, who are good and loving people and were pouring their hearts into their jobs, but were not given up-to-date tools and processes and policies to support them, and were not practicing trauma-informed care, and really had never been trained on how to work with someone who had been severely traumatized and were experiencing PTSD. You know, they weren't delivering care. And so it was very hard to work with those people who cared deeply about their job and about the volunteers and say it wasn't good enough. So it was a very painful chapter in Peace Corps' life. But what it did is, through that, we created a cadre. We had a very, we tried to make it as participatory as we possibly can. It had to be. We had to roll it out to 65 countries, and every single person at Peace Corps needed to be needed to be informed about sexual assault, 101, why it was important, what does it mean, and how does my job relate to this? And so it was a massive commitment. And I really think we changed. I know we changed it for the Peace Corps, but now Peace Corps, I'm proud to say, and this has survived long after I left. I left almost a year and a half ago, but I spoke to the director, Jody Olson, the other day, and they are continuing to advise other government agencies on how to address the issue of sexual assault. They have been asked by the nonprofit world to be able to share some of their training and tools. Peace Corps is really seen as a leader in this initiative or in this important area. It also, as I started to say earlier, really led to other changes to help us to be more volunteer-centered. So the way we deliver our medical care, it led to changes in how we do our application. It led to a lot of changes around trying to be more purposively inclusive in the language that we use. So everything builds on each other, but my faith as a leader was so much a part of who I am that it drove every single thing we did. So I can't really separate it. Mm-hmm. And it was all God, by the way. It wasn't me. God and good people working together.
I'd like to figure out how to transition from this incredibly rich and meaningful discussion about the personal things that you've gone through to stepping back to look at other leaders that you have drawn inspiration from. Even as I'm sitting here, I'm drawing inspiration from both of you and how you've confronted things. But I know from our previous discussions that you, in turn, both of you, have looked at other global leaders and drawn inspiration from them. And I know two of the leaders that feature prominently in both of your lives, Nelson Mandela and Eleanor Sirleaf Johnson. I'd love if we could just take a few minutes and look at their lives and see how faith has impacted their lives and their leadership style, and then we'll see how to tie this all together a bit more. Jono, could you give a little orientation to those two leaders, and then we'll take it from there?
Yes, I always find it fascinating and inspiring to see how great leaders actually are also flawed leaders and how they deal with challenges. So question whether faith can move mountains, I think the lives of Nelson Mandela and Ellen Johnson Sirleaf really show that they can today, and they can move whole countries. With both of those leaders, I had an opportunity to study and write about them, their faith, their family, through the excerpts that a group called Trinity Forum developed from their autobiographies, Long Walk to Freedom for Mandela and This Child Will Be Great for Ellen Sirleaf Johnson. And both were raised with very strong Christian upbringings. Both had mothers who were really the rock of faith in the family. Both grew up in countries with tumultuous times. Mandela, 50 years of vicious legislated racism. Sirleaf with 130 years of basically Black colonial leadership and then a couple decades of Civil War. Both had difficult personal lives with the divorce, and Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was an abused wife of an alcoholic husband. Both were elected president of a country in the first truly democratic election of that country. And both struggled with times of adversity and apparent failure, as we all do. So let's just look, Kathy, if you can just flip to Mandela so we have in mind. Mandela wrote about his Christian upbringing in The Long Walk to Freedom, but he rarely spoke publicly about his faith. He had what we described as a quiet personal faith, and we may come back to that. But through his faith, he really exemplified the best of Christian values. One was humility. I mean, he was incredibly humble. He never took the glory for himself. He was the servant leader and really brought up others in his party. He also exemplified incredible grace. So in the summer of 1992, when he'd been out for a couple of years trying to negotiate how to come into a post-apartheid government. There was a summer of horrific black-on-black violence that was instigated by the South African government. So they decided, the two main parties decided to come together in a big meeting, the two black parties. So there was Mandela from ANC and Buthelezi from the Inkatha party, the Zulus. And Buthelezi gets up and totally castigates Mandela and the ANC and all that. And Nelson Mandela gets up and praises Buthelezi for the things he's done, and shows incredible grace. And he extended grace to everybody, opponents, his warder. The third thing was forgiveness. And he once said that resentment is the only poison that you drink thinking it'll kill your enemy. But he went out and actively forgave. He forgave perpetrators and enforcers of apartheid. Simple gestures like having tea with a wife of the chief architect of apartheid after they moved past that. And also having lunch with the aggressive prosecutor at the trial that put him in prison for 27 years. So incredible examples of humility, grace, and forgiveness. If we turn now and flip to Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was also a rebel as a youth, but became president. She came close to being executed. She was in prison, nearly raped when she was in prison. And she wrote in her autobiography, and I want to read this, about reflecting on these tough times. Through it all, whether in the small closed cell at Stefan Camp, where she almost got raped, or the dark, cold room at Central Prison, whenever I was in trouble, whenever I was in a dark moment, I would close my eyes, and the words of my mother, used to quote from the Bible, would come to me. Be still and know that I am God. These words always gave me strength each time they came to me, each time I thought of my mother. Somebody up there was taking care of business. I knew that was true. And Carrie, who participated in writing the foreword to the excerpt of her autobiography, you really got to know Ellen Johnson Sirleaf firsthand, and have some insights on her faith and how that helped her to stay at peace through amazing transitions.
Yeah, no, it's been really a great privilege to know her since she was elected as president in 2006. My husband, Steve, is one of her economic advisors and was spending a great deal of time in Liberia, especially the first couple of years of her presidency. And so I started going with him to Liberia. And in fact, we stayed at her private home for 2 summers. And so we got to know her family very well. We would have breakfast with them every single day. And it was a huge privilege to get to know her as a person, because as a president, she is incredibly strong and capable and a little intimidating. And people say that all the time about her. But she also has an incredible sense of humor and a very deep faith that, as you mentioned earlier, really came from her family. Her mother was a Presbyterian minister. You know, she told, so in anticipation of this webinar, I actually saw her 2 weeks ago. So I decided to interview her on this subject. I had about 5 minutes before I had to go into another meeting with her that was on a different subject. So I, of course, had read This Child Should Be Great, which is her autobiography. But I wanted to just sort of, on the fly, with no preparation on her part, just ask her about her faith experience. And she said a couple things that I really loved. She said, you know, faith was so much a part of my family's culture and tradition. Like, there's no time in my life that I don't remember my family being, you know, enveloped through love of God. But she said, it was her mother's faith that held her family together. But she said, as I grew up, my mother's faith became my own. And I really believed it. And I thought that was a beautiful way to express it. Her darkest times, there are several dark times. The darkest times were, of course, in prison when she was in solitary confinement. And there's a lot in the book about this. But the whole, what she also said when I interviewed her was the phrase, "Be still and know that I am God." She also said that she came to believe through prayer that she was going to survive, that God spoke to her through prayer, and she knew that she would survive. Even when she was the finance minister, every other minister had been murdered, except for one who had been away in Ghana at the time, Minister of Commerce, I think. And she knew that, but she still believed because God had told her that she would survive, and she knew that her cause was just and that God would care for her. When she was in prison at that time, there were rumors that she was dead already because everybody else was dead. And that actually is a very dangerous thing. If everyone thinks you're dead, then it's really easy for them to kill you, right? And a very vicious army general was coming to visit her, and other political prisoners, because she was not the only political prisoner. In fact, there was another woman in the prison whose name was Lucia Masali. And that woman, Lucia, did not have the same kind of faith that she did. And so she was able to minister with her. She was able to pray with her. And she was able to help Lucia draw a sense of peace from her own faith. And she speaks about how important that was in terms of her own faith journey. She said that her own belief in God freed her to be able to care about other people. And I thought that was just so beautiful. Because one of the, when we're experiencing fear, it's what happens when we are fearful is that we start thinking all about ourselves. It's all about us and our fear. And so, and that's why I really believe that faith is the antidote to all fear, because if you trust in the Lord and believe that God has a plan for you, and you can let it into God's hands, then you experience a peace that passes all understanding, and that frees you to be able to then minister to others and to be concerned about other people and to be a blessing to other people. So I love that about her faith in that story. And I have seen that on so many occasions when she's facing really horrific situations like Ebola, which was the other dark time, which happened before her book. After her book was published. So it's not in her autobiography. The Ebola crisis was an incredibly dark time for her entire nation. But again, she turned to prayer, she turned to God, and she turned to her sister Jenny, who has been her rock since her mother passed away. Her sister Jenny is always with her, and Jenny has a very powerful faith. So that helped her to remain strong during that horrific crisis where she really needed to be positive. She really needed to be clear-headed, and the only way she could do that was to be guided by her faith. So that, I just draw so much inspiration. When I think of what she's been through, nothing that has happened to me comes close to that. Mm-hmm. And so, I think reading about the faith of other leaders can be so incredibly inspiring and can draw us deeper in our own faith, but also can help us, give our burdens to the Lord so that we can then, listen for the still quiet voice of God that will enable us to take the actions that God wants us to do. We can actually be a way of doing God's work in the world.
I'm making notes like crazy myself on practical ideas and things to take away. Reading about others and their leadership and remembering that faith is the antidote to all fear. These are remarkable things, and through our time so far together, we've been hearing themes. Some of the same themes keep coming up around forgiveness and the need for prayer and. One of the things that I am compelled by is a lot of people talk about grit is more predictive of success of a leader than great strategy or being super brilliant, just simple grit. And that's one thing that I'm hearing both of you talk about with both Mendel and Sirleaf. And I just have to say it clearly applies to both of you as well. Any comment about grit?
Grit. There's a whole science to grit. I'm trying to learn about it, actually, the whole concept of positive psychology and wellness and grit. I mean, I think, grit is, grit and resilience, they are often used in the same phrase. But I think there has to be something underneath it. What is it that gives you grit? It's an assurance that you're cared for, that you're loved, and that God is taking care of you. For me, that's critically important.
Jono, any comment about grit? And then I'm going to turn to a few of the questions that the people have been posting.
Yeah, just brief. The whole movement of positive psychology, the last century was all about the Freudian, how do you fix what's wrong? And the guy that developed, Martin Seligman, the field of positive psychology, initially was studying helplessness in concentration camps. And he was presenting at Oxford, and the professor there said, "Well, but you haven't looked at all of the people who have survived." And that's where Seligman developed this concept of learned optimism. And I do think that that having a faith that gives you a sense of the ability to survive, not always physically, but at least spiritually, is just a critical element in, as Carrie points out, not only getting through the storms, but actually doing good along the way.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing, sorry, I hope I didn't cut you off, John.
No.
I also feel that this is going to sound trite, but every challenge is also an opportunity. So if you can rise above whatever the challenge is, it becomes an opportunity to learn, an opportunity to minister to others in our brokenness. And that's where the whole idea of vulnerability is so incredibly important. As a leader, there's a very powerful YouTube video by, I think her name is Brene Brown, about the importance of being a leader that is vulnerable. One of the most important things I did as Peace Corps director was to be open and vulnerable about my sexual assault. And then that freed me to be open and vulnerable about other things. There were plenty of things I didn't know how to handle or to do. But I really feel that the only way we can reach out honestly to other human beings is in all our brokenness, in all our humility, and all of our with all of our fears, and just talk to each other. We don't have to have all the answers. It's really in engaging with others in openness and vulnerability. We're going to arrive at the right place there, but only if we allow ourselves to be open to that power and peace of God.
I really appreciate that. In fact, one of the comments that's come from listeners is from a Peace Corps volunteer who returned and remembers watching Carrie publicly respond to the issue of sexual assault of volunteers, and this viewer talks about that it was a radical change from the silence that had persisted for years. Carrie's honesty and vulnerability as a leader was such a healing moment for so many, given how many returned volunteers work in leadership positions at organizations around the world. I believe the leadership Carrie provided impacted personal healing for many. I just second that. But there's a point down here that the viewer said, I also appreciate Carrie's sharing brings up the fact that we work, the work we all do sometimes intersects with brokenness in our own lives. We don't always share these moments, but Carrie's example points out the personal and organizational benefits of doing so, confronting the brokenness. And there was another question that had come in about prayer. And do you ever find in your times of prayer that you just don't feel the presence of God, or God's absent, or you doubt whether God's really there? And in those moments, you're dealing with brokenness in your own life, you're dealing with hard stuff, and sometimes you pray and you're not getting clear answers. Any comments from both of you about those two topics?
Well, I think of one example when we'd been in Pakistan and had actually gotten a death threat there, and Tina was back having a baby, and I was visiting Kenya to do a project, and then got invited to take a position there, and I didn't know what to do because I was really really committed to the team in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. And so I went to bed and prayed for an answer. And I hadn't been sleeping well, so I figured I'd probably hear something from God. I woke up the next morning, no prayers, no dreams, no answers. So it's kind of God saying, you're on your own. But no, I've never felt that God has deserted me. I feel like it's a constant, coming back to God. I mean, I really admire Carrie and my wife's faith. It's just reflex. It's really deeply embedded. And for me, intellectually, my journey really convinced me without a doubt of the evidence. But I tend to continue to kind of try to do it on my own, which never is the best way to do it. And it's prayer that brings me back. And I think that morning prayer is so critical to keep connected, and then throughout the day. My wife taught me that you can pray while you're driving, while you're doing pretty much anything, and so it's much more. It's an ever-present opportunity to connect with God, and so no, I don't feel deserted by Him. I feel that it's too often something of the reverse, which is a constant process, a constant struggle.
Right, Carrie, any thoughts?
Yeah. I also have never felt abandoned by God. I do sometimes definitely feel like I'm talking at God so that I'm not leaving God any space to, speak back to me. So sometimes I just really have to be intentionally very quiet and really still and meditative, because my inclination is always just to talk. I pray at God and don't leave the space for God then to be able to speak to me. So finding quiet time just to sit and let God's still voice be heard, I think is something that I have to constantly work at. I'm not good at it, by the way. It's so much easier to talk at God. I also sometimes feel awakened in the middle of the night when I'm wrestling with an issue, and I have to pray. And it's funny because I go to a particular place in my house. I have a room that I go to, and I can pray anywhere, and I do pray anywhere. But when I'm really having a tough time, I go to a particular spot in my house and pray on the floor. And that, I don't know what it is about that spot, but it really always helps me. But it's usually the middle of the night. I don't know what's with that, but anyway.
Wow. Thank you for that. I'm looking, there's some wonderful questions that are coming in, and we're just not going to have time to take to consider them all. I think it's really important to touch on one question, wisdom in finding the balance between speaking the hard truth in love and confronting the hard issues with not doing that as a way of vindicating ourselves and seeking vengeance. In other words, how do you find that fine line between confronting the hard things and doing so maybe with the right mind rather than doing it as a way to vindicate ourselves? I think that's something that I'd like to touch on that.
I could start with that, John, if you want.
Yeah.
I have to just say, even in the last week, I've confronted this, because the truth of the matter is that I've been very mad at my attacker. It was buried deep for 30 years, and then every once in a while it raises its head. And the truth of the matter is that I found it, and I confronted it just last week, was that I'm still angry with him. And so I have had to really purposively think about forgiveness. And actually it's interesting, because it was the conversation that we had in preparation for this webinar where, Jono, you were talking about Nelson Mandela's incredible power of forgiveness and how he extended grace to others, everyone, including the people who had imprisoned him and beaten him and robbed him of his life. So I was able to forgive. And I was reflecting on that, and all of a sudden it hit me right between the eyes. I had never forgiven my attacker. And so I had to, although I'm not able to speak to him. I'm not able to speak to him because he passed away, but I have been praying, and anyway, I pray that he knows that I have forgiven him. But it also came to me through that prayer process that I have no idea, and I said this earlier, I have no idea what his life was about. And even though I certainly don't condone what he did to me and to others, because I was not the only one, and that's something I've had to deal with. I mean, one of the things I've had to deal with is the fact that in my silence for 30 years, other people were assaulted. And if I had come forward way earlier, there may have been a different outcome. But anyway,
yeah.
So, anyway, I would just say that this conversation really helped me to realize that I needed to forgive. And that, I don't know if that's what the question was trying to get at, but sometimes I think we have to speak up. Absolutely, we have to speak up. And then other times, maybe I think how you speak up and when you speak up is important. I think you have to honor people's dignity and allow them to do it in quietness, maybe not publicly sometimes, but it's an issue I think we struggle with.
And just one short point on that. What I've observed is that the unforgiving suffer far more than the unforgiven.
Yeah.
The people who have done bad things very often just aren't touched by it, but those of us seeking revenge. And I've seen a very good and capable colleague who was unable to forgive, and basically spent the rest of their life in alcohol and eventually passed away from it. And I think that's one of the powerful lessons about forgiveness, is that it can be cathartic, and that forgiving really can take a weight off.
Yeah.
I know I'm keeping an eye on our clock, and we have to draw things to a close here, and so I'd like to give time for each of our presenters to make one takeaway. Leave us with one takeaway comment. So we'll set them up to do that in just a moment. It's clear to me, we had talked about this also in preparation for this webinar, that the very topics we're talking about are not specific to faith-based organizations. They're not limited to faith-based organizations. These apply to leadership as Christians in leadership anywhere that we work in. And the examples that we're drawing from the WHO and the Peace Corps, these are not known for being faith-based organizations, and yet these are wonderful examples of how faith has inspired both Jono and Carrie and the work that they've done to make good decisions and to make spiritually sound decisions. This discussion about forgiveness is so crucial to all of us as leaders. So as we're getting ready to wrap up, I'd like to give a minute just for both of them to make a closing statement. So let's do Carrie first, and then Jono.
So funny, Doug. You just said the one I was going to say. You don't have to be working in a faith-based institution in order to really exercise your faith and make a difference. Make a difference for God. But I guess the other thing I would just say is confronting fear in your life and trying to identify what the source of that is, and then giving it up to God has been so important to me in my life.
Wonderful. Thank you. Jono? Oops, Jono? Well, we may have lost Jono there. Carrie, are you still with us?
I am.
Okay, well, Jono, I think something happened on your end there, so we'll give you a second to come back. Well, that may not happen. That's too bad. Well, we'll see if we can get a message out from Jono to the community. There's a few other questions that have been raised here that might be nice to reflect on, and I would be willing to see if we could pull together a few thoughts or responses and see how we might send them out. I don't know if that's really possible or not. I just see some really good questions that we're not going to get time to answer here. Well, there I was stalling for a second to see if Jono was going to make it back. I don't know what happened there, but so be it. I do need to draw us to a close today. I really want to thank both Carrie and Jono for doing a marvelous job of taking us through their own faith journeys, their own experience in leadership, and how faith has inspired or affected them as leaders, and then drawing from the wisdom of Nelson Mandela and Eleanor Johnson Sirleaf. What a great session this has been. I've learned a lot, and I've been convicted and blessed, and I pray that everybody who is participating has also been. So thank you all for your time, and Godspeed as you move on to your next journeys and adventures. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.